English Literature Studies.
Welcome back to English Literature Studies. Since we are studying a series of poetry in English literature, today we are going to look at what is lyric. This is a subdivision, this is a category of subjective poetry. We discussed the subjective poetry is centered with the emotions of writer, with the feelings of writer only. It has nothing to do with the emotions, with the feelings, with the thoughts, ideas of the outer world, but with the writer only. So lyric type of poetry is also subjective in nature. The subjectivity and the objectivity of the poetry depends on the handling of the subject matter of the poetry by the poet. It all depends how a writer dealing with the subject. If the subject is centered with the emotions of the writer only, with the thoughts of the writer only, then that is subjective in nature. So the lyric is also subjective in nature. This is a category that falls under subjective poetry. Now let's just look at what is the origin of lyric. The word lyric is derived from a Greek word lyre, lyra, a musical instrument. In ancient times, people used to record their knowledge, their culture, their tradition, their customs in forms of verses. After discovering alphabets and with the time passage, when the people learned about alphabets, when they started writing, they started recording all the data, all the information, knowledge, customs, everything in form of verses. That was the initial type of writing, lyric. And that lyric used to be written in a way that can be sung with an accompaniment of a musical instrument, lyre. So a lyre is a musical instrument with strings, and lyric used to be sung with an accompaniment of that musical instrument. So this is the origin of lyric. Now let's look at what are the characteristics of lyric which make lyric distinct from other types of poetry. It is short poem that deals with emotions. Now what type of emotions? Emotions of the writer only, because it is personal in nature. Since it is a category of subjective poetry, so subjective poetry is subjective in nature, surrounded by the thoughts and emotions of the writer only. So lyric is also personal in nature. This is a very important thing to understand and keep in mind that lyric is always personal in nature. It is an expression of the emotions of the poet only. It follows the single emotion or idea. Let's say suppose a poem starts with a feeling of love, with an emotion of love, hate, grief, pain, complaint. Then that single emotion is followed until the end of the poetry, throughout the poetry. If you see a poem is beginning with an emotion of pain, then that emotion is kept throughout the subject of the poetry. It is a short poem written in stanzas. It has stanzas. It has a musical rhythm meant to be sung. Since it was written to be sung on a musical instrument, it is must to have a musical rhythm. So lyric type of poetry always used to have a musical rhythm, so that it can be easy for the singer to sing lyric on a musical instrument. It is more focused on the emotions rather than intellect of the writer. Whenever writer writes lyric, he follows his emotions rather than showing his intellectual power, his ability to think and his intellectual thinking. He focuses on the emotions. He writes his emotions in lyric. It is non-narrative poem. It is not described by a third or second person. So this is a non-narrative poem. It is a parent form of ode sonnet, and elegy. Now, this is also a very important point to remember. Some other forms of poetry like ode, sonnet, and elegy are the subcategories of lyric. Lyric is a broad category, and ode, sonnet, and elegy fall under this category of poetry, lyric. Structure of lyric. Now, the structure you see in this slide is a very basic and traditional type of, though there may be only two parts or one part only. It is usually based on three parts. It is a traditional structure that I have given you in this slide. Introductory modes of poet. Now, this is the very short part of the lyric that a poet begins with. If he starts with an emotion of happiness, pain, anything that he describes in the beginning, then the second part is larger from other two parts. Thoughts or feelings suggested by the heart. He describes his emotions openly, but those emotions are actually related to the mood of the poet that he has described, that he has begun with. A philosophical turn. This is the last part, and this is not the mandatory one that you will find in every lyric. This can be in a poetry, in any lyric, but this is the very basic structure that used to be followed in ancient times. You might find some variations in some pieces of writing which are called lyric, and those structured evolved with the time. Now you will notice that many lyrics are not written to sing. Nowadays many lyrics are not sung on musical instrument, but they retain their musical rhythm, but they are not sung. So it has evolved with the time. Types of lyric. Now, though these are not very broadly discussed in our literature, but it is good to discuss that it is based on personal emotion of the writer. As the name suggests, personal one is based on the personal emotions of the writer, and the impersonal type of lyric is based on social gatherings like social occasions, wedding, birthday parties, birthday, victory, other ceremonies. Now let's look at one of a very fine example of lyric. Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Written by William Shakespeare. Whenever a thing starts, it evolves with the time. So let's look at how the lyric began from the ancient time and how it evolved. Lyric in ancient times. In ancient times, there used to be two types of lyrics: choral lyrics or monody. Choral lyrics used to be sung by a group of people, and the basic theme of choral lyrics used to be religious. Monody used to be sung by a single person and performed at personal gatherings. Simonides, Sappho, Pindar, Bacchylides. These are some of very important names of lyric in ancient times. Now let's look at how lyric performed in Renaissance. Renaissance brought lyric in England. Renaissance is the intellectual rebirth, when the people started studying literature, ancient Greek literature. So lyric was brought in England with Renaissance. It became very popular in Elizabethan age, when the people were studying literature, when the people were discovering the ancient literature. Thomas Wyatt, Earl of Surrey, introduced Petrarchan sonnets and popularized lyric poetry in 16th century. Thomas Wyatt has a very important role in lyric poetry. He popularized lyric poetry in 16th century. William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney are some of the major poets with the contribution of lyric in Golden Age. So moving on, lyric in Renaissance. The Phoenix Nest, published in 1593, is a form of lyric in Renaissance. England's Helicon, published in 1600, The Paradise of Dainty Devices, published in 1570. These are lyric written in the times of Renaissance. 17th century, Romantic period. Wordsworth, P.B. Shelley, and Keats are major names of 17th century. The lyric poetry was romantic by nature, but it was not adopted by all the poets. Now there's a little confusion that in this period, 17th century, writers were divided into interests. There was a group of writers which was interested in writing romantic poetry, and the other was interested in writing metaphysical. Though this period was majorly heavily influenced with the romantic poetry, but there were also some poets working on metaphysical type of poetry, on metaphysical poetry. So in some books it is defined that this period lyrics were rebellious in nature, because in Elizabethan age romanticism was more centered than materialism. So it is also defined as a period which was rebellious in nature. On the other hand, if we go forward to 18th century, it was more dominated with prose literature, periodical essays and novels. James Thomson is the only name in the contribution of lyric in this period. There was very less contribution in lyric poetry, in poetry basically, and that James Thomson is one of the very prominent name who contributed in this form of poetry, lyric. To better understand the flourishness of lyric in 19th century, we can divide this century into two periods. The initial 32 years, 1798 to 1830, was New Romanticism, and in this period William Blake, John Keats, Astley Coleridge, these writers performed in lyric. And the last 70 years of 19th century, Victorian period, and the names who actually contributed in this period were Tennyson and Browning. There are many other names also, but the major names that you will see are Tennyson and Browning. So to sum up, lyric is a poetry which is centered with the emotions of the writer only. It is personal in nature, and it originated in ancient times with an accompaniment of a musical instrument, and it follows a very good musical rhythm so that it can be played on a musical instrument called lyre. So this is all about lyric in this video. If you have any information regarding this topic, you can share your information related to this topic, lyric, in the comment section. Thank you for watching English Literature Studies.